Good evening and welcome. And welcome back to the second evening and final evening of the Shall Make, Shall Be artist presentations. My name is Golan Levin. I'm professor of electronic art and co-director of the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University, which is our laboratory for atypical, antidisciplinary, and interinstitutional research at the intersection of the arts, science, technology, and culture. I am delighted to welcome to you on this Wednesday, April 6, 2022, to the second and final evening of a lecture series of presentations by the creators commissioned for the Shall Make, Shall Be project, which is a game arts residency program produced by the studio in which 10 artists, game designers, and collectives were selected through an open call to create playable artworks themed around the individual amendments in the US Bill of Rights, one game per amendment, drawing on their effects, interpretations, and legal meanings in United States culture. These works are meant to be understood as critical games, using the mechanisms of play to critique and inform our understanding of civil liberties in the 21st century. If you're just tuning in, the Shall Make, Shall Be project was conceived by our good friend and studio curator-in-residence, Luc Dubois, who is co-director of the programs in integrated design and media at the NYU Tangent School of Engineering. We're thrilled to announce that the games that the artists made will be featured in an exhibition this coming summer at the Grand Rotunda of the Federal Hall National Memorial in New York City, the building where the Constitution was signed, opening July 4th, 2022. The commission's exhibition, the forthcoming monograph, and even the words I'm speaking right now were organized in close collaboration with Luc Dubois, as well as editorial director Lane Nooney, who is assistant professor of media and information industries in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at NYU, and curation and exhibition director John Sharp, who is professor of games and learning at Parsons School for Design at the New School in New York City. I believe we'll be joined later by John for the Q&A. The United States Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, are an integral part of US political discourse and form a core set of beliefs for the civil religion of the United States. Our understanding, misunderstanding, and varying interpretation of these rights and their implications are foundational to much of what unites and divides us as a nation. By reframing as rights those liberties that in the 18th century were available only to a privileged few, the 10 amendments provide us with a 10 commandments in reverse. Rather than prescribing the behavior of the individual, they create explicit restrictions on what the higher power, in this case the government, can do with regard to its citizens. The Bill of Rights really is the napkin sketch for our understanding of what it is to be an American. Like all sketches, it leaves lots of room for interpretation. In this project, we hope to highlight how games, which operate by proposing and enacting new modes of direct participation, can help us improve our cognitive model of the Bill of Rights. Games are an ideal medium for accessibly, educationally, and critically exploring the mechanics of the US Constitution. An interactive schoolhouse rock for the early 21st century is how we've conceived the Shall Make, Shall Be project. This has been our goal, to share then 10 works that give us a space to consider the underlying foundations of the American experiment and the identity and life that these 10 amendments created. We believe these 10 works help us see new paths forward to pursue a chance at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Finally, a word from my perspective at the Studio for Creative Inquiry. Today, our rights and responsibilities as citizens are being contested as never before. Evolving interpretations of the Constitution both reflect and perturb a rapidly changing world, impacting everything from the fabric and daily life of American society to our survival as individuals and even as a species. Meanwhile, accelerated by the COVID pandemic perhaps, games have overtaken the global film industry and also broken through to serious credibility as a mode of critical and contemporary art practice. The Shall Make, Shall Be project, straddling contemporary art, game design, popular media, social activism, and constitutional law, is precisely the type of adventurous and interdisciplinary investigation that the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry exists to foster. We're proud to present this timely reflection on the rights that govern our lives as refracted through the lens of this vital and popular medium of interactive games. The schedule for tonight, it will be as follows. The artists are presenting in the order of the Bill of Rights amendment that their project addresses, and there are 5 presentations. Peter Bradley at 5:10 p.m. Eastern Time, Arnab Chakravarty and Ian McNeely from Broken Ghost Immersives and their collaborator Moaw at 5:30, Danielle Isadora Butler at 5:50 p.m., Ryan Kuo at 6:10 p.m., and the collective arts.codes, which is Melissa F. Clarke and Margaret Schedel at 6:30 p.m. This will be followed then by a panel of tonight's speakers led by John Sharp from 6:45 until 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So for that, we're going to take a 5-minute break, and at 5:10 p.m. in 5 minutes, we will check back in with Peter Bradley. See you soon. Good evening and welcome back to the presentations of Shall Make, Shall Be. This is our final evening, but the first of 5 presentations this evening. And our first presenter tonight is Peter Bradley, whose project considered the Sixth Amendment. Peter Bradley is a conceptual artist whose recent work is about computers and metaphysics. Applied first to music and the concept of keys, and now to language and the notion of semantic similarity, his practice aims to test the limits of computation, to capture the meaning of an idea as its being is reduced to quantity. Peter lives in New York City and tours as a member of Japanese Breakfast. Peter Bradley.
Hi, Golden. Thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so as you mentioned, my day job is not really as a computer scientist or a game designer per se, or even an artist, really. I'm a guitarist in a band. And my background from a university perspective is really in the humanities. I studied French and comparative literature, and then I studied philosophy and aesthetics. However, I got interested in this line of work and in game design a few years ago when I had an idea for a board game, which was about music, and specifically the concept of the key in music. I read a really fantastic novel by Thomas Moaw that told the story of a fictional composer in the 20th century, and it inspired me to create this game, which I called Labyrinth. I'm going to show a trailer. So in that game, you select a home key here. And you're pitted against a computer opponent who's playing for its own key as you go back and forth, trading chords, creating a song. At the end of the game, you end up with this kind of mini representation of the little song you put together. Then you take that download, create something more substantial for yourself. The thing that really interested me in my work in Labyrinth was this idea of a game as an essay, or like a game that somehow takes a position. Like in this case, the code actually embodies some ideas that I came to have about the concept of key, how it functions in music, what the limits of one key are into another. When I finished that work, I became interested in a subset of computer science called natural language processing. And I knew that the next project I wanted to work on would deal somehow with language. Within that space, there's an idea called a word vector, which is an important concept of the idea how we represent words computationally, how they might be reduced to number in one fashion or another, so that the computer can work with them. If you're doing some kind of like AI research on human language, or that's used in all sorts of different approaches. And as I was reading up on this concept of word vectors, I started to think about how we might represent language in space. And that became sort of just the inkling of an idea for my next project. There's a linguist called Saussure, who is an important 20th century thinker, who created this idea of differential net of meaning, which means that a word signifies in such a fashion as it's like related to all the other words around it. Take a word like cat, for instance. It's anchored in language along categories of similarity and difference, and categories above it and items, or the category of like types of cats underneath of it. to kind of simplify the whole idea. So, you know, like a cat is a pet. In our culture, like a cat is the opposite of a dog. You bring to certain words your own psychological formation and personal history that also contributes to that meaning. So for me, like cat is connected to this Baudelaire poem that I studied in college and that I really love, and so it has all these associations about like 19th century Paris or something like that. And I wanted to sort of just like distill this idea of a semantic net. That is the way that one word is ingrained with and meshed with all of the others in the way that it acquires its meaning, and present it in a spatial fashion that people could just traverse. That's about the time that I became aware of the shall make, shall be proposal. And I took a look at the amendments, and I mean, I guess like the first amendment was in some ways a kind of natural companion to this idea of language and what I wanted to do. But at the same time, I was really captivated by an old philosophical metaphor, which is like the prison house of language. It's something that Nietzsche said and Jacobson took up. The idea being that when you're enmeshed in language in the fashion I'm talking about, you can't escape it. It's just this sort of like Kafkaesque house of signifiers that are constantly relating to one another. And I thought that there was something just really poetic and interesting about that, that could serve as the fundamental theme of the game. So I hit on the Sixth Amendment, which deals with the rights of the accused in criminal proceedings, and set about work trying to get to the back end of what would be an enormous dictionary, more or less, that would serve as a way to navigate this linguistic space. So this is just like a Python library that I wrote to begin this process. And you can see here this idea of the semantic sets. So that's what I was trying to explain, perhaps a little bit poorly earlier. If we have a given word, there's like an axis of similarity and an axis of category, which I took to be like the fundamental organizing principle to get towards the meaning. Let's speed up a little bit just for the sake of time. Once like that back end was built out, we could do something like this, which is just kind of like a shell representation of what happens in the actual game. Given a word like abuse, you know, I've gone and mined from a zillion different sources, all of these like closely related words, either on that category axis or in the similitude axis. And you can just see how they're kind of relating together. And then I got this game engine called Godot. It's like an open source version of Unity. This is just an example of all of the zillions of lines of code that are necessary to create a video game. And it's a great tool though. You can like sort of have your world and it keeps all of your resources nice and well organized for you as you're building up your idea. Okay, now we'll transition into some actual game footage. This is the introduction. The conceit is that you're a ball of ink on the National Mall and you're trying to get to the Supreme Court House in order to sort of, you know, argue your case. But as the game says, you move semantically. It's kind of a hard concept to explain quite quickly. So we get into this tutorial, which I hope makes it nice and clear to players. Okay, in real life, the game is, of course, like one long sequence, but I had to chop it up just for the sake of screen caps. So a synonym is going to move you to the right, and an antonym will move you to the left. Jumping or moving forward, which in like a hardcore linguistic sense is called a hypernym, is accomplished by sort of supplying a category. So in that sense, like size is the category that contains small, where the opposite, length, is contained in the category of size. You can also like change parts of speech in place. or submit words that are contained in other words or that contain words in them. And then the gavel is a key concept here, as it sort of bridges the gap between the amendment and this more free play of just language. They occur throughout the different levels, and they come back to the key concepts of the Sixth Amendment, or what I've identified as like the most important words that contribute to its meaning, one of which is counsel. And then just like in, quite a lot of video games like this, there's a time element and a life element. Once you move your way through this little tutorial and the lily pads, you get into like a sort of time trial component, which I think is really fun. So you're up against the clock here, and you're trying to avoid these obstacles by supplying new words to that head word on the screen, which I call the seed word. Here, yeah, a creature is an organism, plant is an organism, type thereof. We get another gavel, so we get into this world of counsel, attorney, what that really means. The next segment is the stairs. Once I kind of had this concept, we're just like running with different iterations of how we can put those linguistic moves together. So whereas the time trial element is kind of more about that similitude axis, it's playing synonyms or antonyms as you try to understand the word on the screen. This one is very much about the categorical axis. And as we think about the containing categories, that's something like justice or recompense might fit into. Speed this up a little bit. There's another little room in here. This one is kind of like a tile game. It's an overhead look, and you're attempting to like avoid black tiles as you make your way through the room. And then this is the final level or segment, if you want, which you finally make it into Little Supreme Court. Still kind of working on the architecture. I think it sort of looks like a cheap mega church at the moment. It'll get there. That's ink. And then this last game, the idea is that you move from one word to another. So here from snow to friend in 9 moves or less. I think I'll probably relate these closer to those key terms that I was talking about the amendment before: speedy, public, nature, cause, witness. Although I am quite interested in just these sort of like unassuming but like very full, simple words, and how you might be able to move from one to another. Yeah, so that's the game where it stands. Development is like really close to being finished. I think that in a lot of ways it enacts like legal history. Just like if you are tuned into Supreme Court oral arguments or Supreme Court papers at all, like they spend a ton of time trying to figure out what is the meaning of a term. Like I was listening to a case from this term about transportation workers. And the whole 3 hours of oral argument were devoted to the idea of like, what is a stevedore, which is a person who moves cargo on a to and from ships, and whether or not like stevedore could be contained in the category of transportation worker. And similarly, I think that like the case history of the Sixth Amendment is like I'm saying about these key terms, like what counts as speedy? How do we understand that word? So my hope is that ingraining people in this sort of like semantic nexus as they try to associate their way around a word like speedy or public or nature ultimately brings them closer to the meaning of those terms, and kind of like enacts that lawyerly or that like jurisprudential type of semantics. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. I have never seen anything like this in terms of this sort of word to vec as a kind of technological principle for spatial navigation. It's fascinating. I mean, reminds me of Semantle a little bit, which is kind of like a guessing game, but the idea that you can sort of navigate using word space as a kind of a way of moving forward through this net, and then kind of coming to understand the terminology in the Sixth Amendment this way. It's really a fascinating project. Thank you so much. We will see you, I hope, at around 6:45 for the Q&A. And we're going to take a few-minute break right now. And next up after this will be Broken Ghost Immersives. So we'll catch you all in about 3 to 4 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to Shall Make, Shall Be. Next up, we are joined by Ian McNeely and Arnab Chakravarty, both from the Broken Ghost Immersives Collective, and their collaborator, Moaw, also known as Moaw. Ian McNeely holds an MFA in theater arts from Brown University, where he wrote and produced a series of original rock operas. McNeely was awarded the Oregon Shakespeare Festival's 2009 Rex Raybould Fellowship and delivered the keynote speech at their annual HIV/AIDS fundraiser, the Daedalus Project. He is the founder and artistic director of Broken Ghost Immersives, which produces theatrical events inspired by games. Arnab Chakravarty, also from Broken Ghost Immersives, is a designer, technologist, and educator with a background in building interfaces for communities overlooked by dominant technology platforms. Previously, he worked as an ethnographer and designer in several multinational organizations. At NYU ITP, his interests have focused on living with the things that he makes, creating immersive experiences for co-liberation and discovering what makes people touch things. Moaw, known professionally as Moaw, is a video game developer specializing in pixel art. They work to build creative communities through game development, bridging dialogues between STEM and art, and have worked professionally with many companies to make games and pixel art advertisements. Outside of commercial work, they design open source game development assets and participate in accessible education initiatives. Folks, I'm pleased to welcome Broken Ghost Immersives and Moaw. Take it away, folks.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to talk about our bespoke arcade game, verbal gymnastics, all about the US Constitution's 7th Amendment. You can see a little bit of our graphic assets there of what the courtroom looks like in our game. And it is a playable work exploring the 7th Amendment. A little bit about us. Arnab and I work in with an interactive theater company in New York called Broken Ghost Immersives. And we produce wildly interactive stories that have user agency, where audience members get to influence the direction of the plot, they get to participate. It's meant to be very inclusive and very hands-on. We've got some pictures there of what these events look like. They're raucous and have a lot of creative energy. And so our background that we're coming to this with is a point of view that people should be involved. They should have control over the steering wheel of what happens. And what better way to explore that than an arcade game? We can see here some work, the style of art we're working with. This is from Moaw's portfolio, this awesome pixel art style that we'll talk more about later on in the presentation.
Yeah, I think Moaw, can you talk about yourself?
Hi. Yeah, no, thank you. I'm Moaw. I use they, them pronouns. Also go by Moaw online. Pixel art is a specialty of mine. Working within limitations, I think, is a great way to teach other artists and technologists about the limitations of the medium and more about the technology that determines those limitations. And I think there are a lot of things for the project that we're working on that definitely references that era of technology. Go ahead.
Yeah.
So these are some of the samples of the works we produced in New York. The Bunker was a sci-fi immersive that was in a basement in the Lower East Side, and groups of people got to work together. It was kind of like a choose your own adventure where they navigated this plot. We also produced a supervillain version of the same idea called the Rogues Gallery. And you can see this awesome prop in the middle is maybe a prototype of our first arcade game. Arnab made this. Arnab, tell us a little bit about what we're looking at.
Yeah, well, this was basically an escape room in a box. The funniest thing was, like, I met Ian on probably my first day in New York. Like, I flew in for grad school and bam into Ian, and somehow I just ended up making this escape room in a box for a final in my first semester, and we basically started working ever since.
So the 7th Amendment, right? This is where we're going. It's the right to a jury trial in civil cases, in federal civil cases. So it's not one that people are super familiar with. It's one that when we first put our heads together to look for which of the amendments we might want to explore, it sort of called to us for all the same reasons we wanted to make these interactive theater pieces. I think it was called to us because it had a performative element that lawyers argue in front of a jury. It's dynamic, like a game where there's a winner and a loser with some kind of a competitive element. And it just felt fun. Court proceedings conjured up images of the entertainment industry. But we also couldn't talk about this without the context of when this call went out. The last 2 years, COVID has been the biggest changer of how we do things. And obviously, if you had to pick the worst industry to try to produce, it was live in-person entertainment in close quarters, interacting and touching stuff together. COVID just crushed it. So Arnab and I, when the call went out for creators, we're at a moment of inflection, and we were pivoting away from live theater, which we just couldn't do, to digital offerings. And Arnab, you got some pictures on the left from your experiment with Pig Iron Theater in Philly, right?
Yeah, it was a sound AR game for 2 players to play at the same time. So if people were in a bubble, they could basically play this game together.
Awesome. On the right-hand side, I've got some pictures from what I pivoted to, which was creating this app with a Japanese company called Mixi. It's a choose-your-own-adventure app for young adults. But what we were both exploring were how we could take the lessons we'd learned producing interactive theater and apply them to a purely digital context without any in-person interactivity. And lo and behold, this call came out and we decided the 7th Amendment was the way to go. And we'd like to talk a little bit about the inspiration that drew us there. Arnab, you were telling me you have a really unique perspective on our jury system. Tell me about that.
Well, yeah, because I grew up in India, so which is ironic that I'm making a game about the Bill of Rights of America without being American. It's probably one of the most interesting stories of my life. But I come from a system where it follows the British judge-based system, and my first recollection of anything jury-based was the O.J. Simpson trials, which was broadcast into Indian homes because of CNN and cable TV in the early 90s.
Isn't it funny? Yeah, the impression, I feel the same thing. The impression I got of juries was shaped entirely from what I saw on TV. Better Call Saul is a classic show, but as a kid, I remember staying home sick and watching Perry Mason, which is from the 60s, it's black and white. And the whole thing it always turns on how they talk to the jury. And so the 7th Amendment, the right to a jury trial, is an exciting premise because we have this jury of your peers who are wildly variable in what they can find. One of the reasons we learned this from the lawyer that we were consulted with, is that one of the reasons people don't often choose to go to jury trials in civil cases is because they have no idea what people will do. It's hard to predict how human beings will interact with this, with the system. But so this is the element we wanted to build the whole game around. These unreliable actors. How do you hack this element and make a whole game around convincing these humans to your point of view?
So yeah, I think when we started, we basically wanted to make a game in which players go head to head against each other, and their body is being tracked, and they have to squeeze through these insanely difficult holes as their argument kind of progresses during the gameplay. We imagine that people would kind of match the beat to a spoken and recorded rhyme that was playing in the background, and if they basically missed any of these holes that they were kind of putting themselves in, the holes, their scores would reduce, and basically at the end of the game, whoever kind of performed won. This had kind of majorly 2 issues. When we first tried it out, to play this game, body tracking in Unity was extremely slow based on the algorithms like we had access to, say, a year ago. And as an arcade experience, one player waiting for the other player to finish was extremely kind of boring. And the way that we had imagined it, it would kind of go on for 15, 20 minutes, which was a complete no-no in a gallery setting. So it's also then when we kind of started talking to a lot of legal experts, and what we realized was that underneath the jury system, which kind of was established as a hedge by Americans to protect themselves against the British, when America was still being controlled by the British, it became a way for the majority in America to kind of inflict their prejudices, their biases onto the minorities, which has ebbed and flowed based on the decade that you select. So we basically kind of doubled down on this idea that the game had to have the performance of the truth at the core of it. So we eliminated the spoken poetry because in the performance of the truth, the words don't really matter at all. And the idea of catching the vibes of the jury to make sure that basically they win. So in its current iteration, how the game functions is basically at the start, you're given a choice of 7 members. It's a single player game, and you have to select 5. Each of them respond to a certain kind of color, which we are calling the vibes, which is based on these ideas of logos, pathos, ethos, the 3 predominant ways of discourse as defined by the Greeks. But the idea is players using their hands have to catch these vibes, and if they catch the wrong vibes for each of these jury members, they lose points, and at the end they are awarded a very unfair result. And this is what's going on in the surface. But what we also built in a mechanism at the bottom of it was this idea that unknown to the players, certain animals hated certain other animals. So if you ended up in a scenario where your defendant was a peacock, or like it was a donkey, and most of the jury members were elephants, there was no way you were going to win no matter how much you performed. So the idea was that in this arcade game, if players might end up in a situation where they perform great, but the final award that they get is extremely low, which kind of makes people question the inherent unfairness of the system, and is something that we want to elicit. There are hints to it that the players would kind of get while selecting the jury members, but again, it won't be exposed to them initially. And what we imagine is like once they finish, they'll have a chance to read through the game design document so that they understand why they failed even when they kind of won. So the larger level idea we want to leave players with, and the question is that even if you performed well and you won, was justice actually served? And I'll skip over the technology slide, but we also kind of got a chance to build a great arcade machine, which we've already finished, and are currently in progress of wrapping everything up, which I'll hand over to Meena to talk about.
Hi, thank you so much. As Arnab covered before, communicating the significance of performance and gaze is critical to this game. There's a really interesting tension between what each character is experiencing internally and what they are externally expressing. Thank you. Oh, no, that was good.
Next one? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you, sorry. While much of the jury's biases are hidden through the code, the player has to assume these biases through gameplay and the reactions of the members of the court. So portraiture is a huge priority in terms of assets, as the expressions of court members carry significant thematic and mechanical weight. So for example, characters like the bailiff, who's like that little dog character you've seen throughout our presentation, and the defendant have a heightened awareness of the jury's gaze. The bailiff plays the role of the insider. Having had years of experience in the court, he's able to read a jury. When you're on the jury selection screen, he's a bit of a gossip, He's not afraid to throw asides to the player and let them know how their odds are looking. The defendant, in turn, being very aware of how they're perceived and their own species bias, will communicate throughout the case how anxious they're feeling. Also giving more context into what the species like biases may be within the jury. Next slide, please. Other fun visual challenges to consider was making text and performance dynamic. This is a challenge long remedied by fighting games, which express immense dynamicism through text and games effects, which pop out throughout play. These effects communicate physical impact, character impact. Capcom, which is a game studio long famous for its fighting games, takes a really unique approach with these effects through their game Phoenix Wright, which is a legal drama with parts visual novel, mystery, and has a lot of fighting game flair. Phoenix Wright used the impact of exclamations, which you can see to the left of the slide, to provide weight to moments in its narrative. Next slide, please. Taking notes from Phoenix Wright and other fighting games, our goal with visual effects was to provide an equally informative, but also visually stressful experience for the player. Just constant stimulus everywhere while you're playing. This also goes back to the nature of, 8-bit and the visual language of the arcade era, right? Where arcade era games just visually demanded and screamed attention from its players and also bystanders walking around the arcade. Our cabinet is proud to boast the same visual obnoxiousness throughout its play. So you can see in the next slide some of the gameplay here. The hands are popping the vibes along the tracks as some of the vibes are collected. You can see both the judge and your defendant kind of popping in, expressing and reacting to what is happening throughout play. And yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I think that wraps up our presentation. We hope you'll all come on July 4th and play this game with us. And yeah, this has been a long road of really amazing twists and turns, but we are so glad to be here and finally be doing this in the way which was definitely not how we started to imagine it, but we are very proud to kind of have it in the position that we have. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
And thank you, Arnab, Ian, and Mina. Thank you so much. This was lovely. And that was really popping at the end there. Thank you. That was fantastic to see. Okay, we're going to take a 2-minute or about a minute and a half break before our next speaker from Shall Make Shall Be. So we will break now and we'll catch you in about a minute. Welcome back to Shall Make, Shall Be. Next up, we're pleased to be joined by Danielle Isadora Butler, whose project considered the Eighth Amendment excessive punishment. Danielle Isadora Butler designs experiences, installations, and objects that create new opportunities for emotional connection. She has designed and produced playgrounds that teach about cooperation, multisensory poetry archives that encourage deep listening, and large-scale games that connect participants to their locales. Her skills in human-centered design extend from a background that combines arts education, creative technology, and restorative justice. Butler believes that building relationships is the key to engaging people in issues that feel too large or abstract to comprehend. She's especially passionate about improving access to water and using creative interventions to deepen New Yorkers' relationship to their harbors. She is co-founder of both the Tideland Institute and the Awesome on the Water organization, which support cultural initiatives on New York City waters. Folks, I'm pleased to welcome Danielle Isadora Butler. Hi, Danielle.
Hello.
Welcome. Take it away.
Thanks, Golan. And thank you for those who are watching these talks. My name is Danielle Butler. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm joining you from the Lenape land of Brooklyn, New York. I'll be telling you about my interactive piece on the Eighth Amendment and how I arrived at this design. I'm an artist and designer. Most of my work is centered on relationship building. I'm specifically interested in how to create experiences that allow us to emotionally connect to topics that feel large and overwhelming. Much of my current work is centered on the waterways of New York and building creative ecosystems that enable us to make a more integrated and connected future on the water and the systems that allow our city to function. I'll tell you about a few of my past projects as a way of orienting you to the design philosophies that I used in making this Eighth Amendment project. I believe that one of the hardest things about engaging people in a large, complex issue like punitive justice or place in the environment is finding the right way in. Finding a small but meaningful piece of the story to connect to. This piece I co-created in 2020, New York's most socially distanced office. It uses humor, visually telling a joke that because of our shared trauma, we now all get. And in doing so, it is a little bit of a release valve. In New York, there is a boundary around the water. We look at it, but we rarely question why there aren't more ways to get to it and on it. By putting the familiar, an office complete with computer, desk, filing cabinet, and water cooler on the water, we are gently breaking a perceived boundary and suggesting that the water is a place. Bringing people physically onto the water takes this one step further. These are images taken at the Lost Island concert series at a place where Muscle Island once was. The island was dredged out in the 1920s to make the Newtown Creek more navigable for industrialized uses of the canal. We held a paddle-in concert over that spot. A 16-person brass band used the decks of a historic tugboat as a stage, and over 40 canoes and miscellaneous craft paddled in. The Lost Island concert series celebrates New York Harbor while also inviting people to consider a complicated relationship with the water. When you arrive in your physical body at a place that is both polluted and teeming with life, you are suddenly more prepared to engage in the complexities of New York's history and future on the water. Exploration and surprise is a device for creating meaningful moments. When I was asked by the creator of Universe in Verse, a live performance series that showcases poems about science, to create a physical archive for their recordings, I thought about how to make an experience that gets you ready to listen to a poem. I made a miniature natural science collection in a type tray and hid a door inside it. It was not for everybody to discover, but if you took a chance and pulled open a small door, your curiosity would be rewarded with a periscope up to the heavens and a poem pulled at random just for you. The lights would dim, a subtle breeze would blow, and make a moment of calm focus for you to receive your poem. We know that we feel something is more meaningful when we discover it or learn it for ourselves. I employed these methods of physicality, exploration, and finding a small part of the story to tell in my work for Shall Make Shall Be. The Eighth Amendment is the shortest of all of the amendments. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Just 16 words. But what does it mean? What does excessive mean? And why does something have to be both cruel and unusual for it to be unconstitutional? Our system for holding, punishing, and killing people is large and complex. Harms multitudes of people and communities, and is a place for instilled racism to play out legally. It felt daunting to find an entry point small and succinct enough for people to engage with this topic, do justice to a small platform that I have, and respect the people that were harmed by the laws that are defined by this amendment, all well in the context of a game. But I'll tell you a little bit about my process. In the court case Trupp v. Doles in 1958, a potential interpretation is laid out. The amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. This benchmark is determined by courts examining prevailing opinions of state legislatures, sentencing juries, judges, and the American public. I find this phrase deeply fascinating for many reasons. It suggests that, and even it suggests an understanding and even an acceptance that we are not operating at our best and that we are not as decent as we could be in the future. 2, words like evolution and maturing suggest a linearity to this progress. 3, it carries hope and belief that we are evolving towards something better. And 4, if the standard is based on who we vote for and what we culturally accept, it shifts the onus of this change away from the vagaries of intractable bureaucracies and onto us, the public. Despite the unwieldy concept of mass culture change, I find this empowering. I was curious to know where the evolution has taken us so far. I read most of the Supreme Court decisions that deal with Eighth Amendment cases. I pulled out cases that felt like they demonstrated this evolutionary shift. And examining them, a few things came forward. 1, what was once normal is now abhorrent. It is astounding how recently laws condoned things that now seem abhorrent. For example, when do you think we stopped executing children? 2005 is when Roper v. Simmons, the court determined that the majority of Americans now opposed sentencing children to death. That seems very recent to me. 3, that evolution is not linear. For 4 years in the 1970s, the death penalty was unconstitutional. It was then reinstated in 1976. Another example, generally laws around sentencing children have been trending away from mandatory sentences and life without parole. Yet just last year, the court decided that it was again okay to give children life without parole. So it is this inquiry that is the concept behind my game. These are the constraints that I felt would make it successful. I wanted it to be self-directed. I want people to be able to walk up and be able to play without any instruction. I need it to be respectful to those harmed by the punitive system. I didn't want to make a game that made light or gamified prison or sentencing. I wanted any conclusions to be arrived at by the user and not prescribed by the piece. Justice is so often envisioned by the metaphor of scales balanced. I am making a gimbaled marble labyrinth. The gimbal allows for balance but it is set by the user. The gimbal allows players to tilt the surface of the maze in all directions and use gravity to control the marble within the pathways of the labyrinth. The layout is inspired by seating arrangements of the Senate and House. The marble's path begins by tracing the words, "The amendment must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society." This frames how I want players to consider the cases that follow. Beginning with the signing of the Bill of Rights, the players shift the surface of the table to guide the marble through major Eighth Amendment cases. The goal of gameplay is to stay on the path and not fall into the holes, which represent areas of the punitive system that are not protected by the Eighth Amendment, like immigration trails or pre-trial jails. Each case is distilled into a succinct statement. All legal terms that enable us to remain distant have been reverted to the simplest layman terms. For instance, juvenile and minors are instead called children. The feel of the game will be fairly institutional. CNC plywood will be painted black, gray, and white. Holes to avoid will be rimmed with red. The documents of the Supreme Court are only allowed to be in certain fonts, Century Schoolhouse or slight variations. And so the game and the accompanying materials will also follow those rules. Overarching goals of the game, for me, the designer, are to essentially slow a player down enough to give them an opportunity to examine this information in juxtaposition and invite inquiry into the cruelty that is normalized. So you will all be able to play this game in Federal Hall 3 months from now. And I have so many legal scholars and people to thank, and thank you, Colin, for hosting these presentations.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was lovely. We are now going to break for a few minutes, take a breather, and we will be back at 6:10 p.m. in 7 minutes, or 6 minutes or so, with Ryan Kuo, who will be talking about his project, which considers the lesser known Ninth Amendment. So we'll see you all very shortly, and see you in a minute. Welcome back, everyone, to our presentations of Shall Make, Shall Be. Next up, we are joined by Ryan Kuo, whose commissioned project for Shall Make, Shall Be considers the lesser-known Ninth Amendment. Ryan Kuo creates works that are process-based, diagrammatic, and caught in a state of argument. He uses video games, productivity software, web design, and text to produce circuitous and unresolved movements that track the passage of objects through white escape routes. He holds a Master of Science in Art, Culture, and Technology from MIT and has held residencies at Pioneer Works and the Queen's Museum Studio Program. Kuo's works have been shown in venues such as the Whitney Museum of American Art, Queen's Museum, Transfer, and Bitform's Gallery, and are distributed online at Left Gallery. His recent and forthcoming projects include File, a user's manual, an artist book about aspirational workflows modeled after software guides for power users, and Faith, a conversational AI agent that zealously embodies the blind faith underpinning both white supremacy and miserable white liberalism. Most recently, Ryan has been recognized with a 2022 Knight Arts and Technology Fellowship. Folks, I'm pleased to welcome Ryan Kuo.
Thank you. I'm going to share my presentation here. Okay. Let's see. So I'm an artist and writer based in New York. I was also a game journalist in the past decade, but I won't get into that. A lot of my work is computer-based, but I'm not a programmer or designer. Instead, I tend to start with an intuitive response to an image or a prompt, and I elaborate and add layers and complications from there, according to how the system or framework that I'm using is feeding back to my process. This is an image from my show at Bitform's Gallery in 2018 called The Pointer, which consisted of one self-playing work made with a game engine, one video animated with Keynote, which is what I'm using to present these slides right now, and one Mac application. This is an installation view of the Mac application along with the software boxes that it came in, which represents one subset of the work I make, which takes the form of a computer interface and accepts user input. So this one is an app that uses Mac Windows and controls. One aspect I'm focused on and playing against is the seamlessness of a modern UI. So as an example, this is a web remake of that Mac piece. It's called OK2. I call it a whiteness sequencer, and whiteness is synonymous in many ways with a computer interface today. It represents neutrality. It tries not to refer to itself, instead letting the other person, i.e. the user, take all the responsibility for what happens with it, because this neutral white interface means well. It claims to have the best intentions for the user. So in this piece, you basically press the buttons of this well-meaning whiteness and it gets triggered. This is a voice-activated piece called Faith, which I built in collaboration with Pioneer Works at a residency a few years ago. It's a kind of contrarian shadow of voice assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Cortana. And here is an excerpt.
Hello.
Hello.
Have we met?
You know the answer to that.
I'll be the judge of that.
That's what I just said.
I can decide for myself.
You already said that.
I don't know what you think I said.
I can see right here on the screen.
How is this relevant? You're overlooking some vital details.
All the details are actually written out right here.
You can't even handle a basic argument.
Come on, give me a break.
Typical.
And in part, this bot came out of a study of online dynamics between trolls who engage in bad faith dialogues and what I call miserable liberals who engage in good faith dialogues powered on things like moral arguments or pure reason, but which enable those bad faith dialogues. So the combination of the two more or less results in a zero-sum dialogue. What I'm responding to and contending with here is the idea of a feminized presence that is always here for your input and which you expect to help you. So part of the provocation is, what if your input is not inherently interesting? What if the things that come out of your mouth are not taken to heart, but are instead played with by this program? The most recent project is this web commission for the Whitney Museum that runs for 30 seconds on the Whitney's website. It basically interrupts you as you're browsing if that happens to be during sunrise or sunset Eastern. So this piece has a lot of text, but what I'm trying to convey in this short time frame is not even so much about textual content than about the way that the content becomes persuasive. So I'm using the Whitney's typeface, and after the piece is done, it's calling attention to how the Whitney conveys authority through printed language. This language makes you want to trust the institution. And I think that today on each of our screens and platforms, we each want to convey that sort of authority. I don't really think of this as a technological break per se, but as a through line that runs through many different formats and contexts. And what I'm more broadly influenced by in my practice is a childhood spent arguing with people on Usenet and now doom scrolling Twitter, where anybody can say anything. And because what anybody says appears to hold together as a sentence in a box, suddenly everyone has to deal with it as a self-contained idea, as though it were birthed in a vacuum. So that brings me to my piece for this show, which is called Father Figure, and I'll discuss the title at the end. But it's about the 9th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which effectively states that just because you have rights that are written down, that doesn't mean that you don't have other rights too. And my understanding is that this was initially meant as a check on federal power. The Constitution cannot automatically limit your rights by excluding them from its list. And I think it's hard to argue with that. But my reaction to the wording is that it spells out an exception to the rules that I think embodies a spirit of exceptionalism. So what are the unlisted rights? You know them if you know. They should be self-evident truths to you and to you only. The fullness of your rights must remain in excess of what can be fixed. We can't write them down for everyone, perhaps for the same reason that we in America cannot allow society to limit the individual at the end. I'm extrapolating about this, I'm not a legal scholar, but when I read this amendment, I immediately thought of people resisting mask and later vaccine mandates to the point of violence during the pandemic. That continues. They're always evoking in these cases some kind of American spirit that can't be muzzled. I think they're saying, I don't know what your rights are, but I have the right to place myself above or apart from society. I have the right to live as a self-contained unit. So I'm most interested in this assumption of knowingness. I know my rights, when people say. So the question for me is, how do you know your rights? Where does your mind go when it gets a hold of those rights? The 9th is saying there's a written space here on this piece of paper, and there's an unwritten space somewhere beyond. So the idea is to sketch out that dichotomy of spaces in a game world. And this is a rigid space at the beginning, and then it becomes a murkier space. The player is an atomized user inside a bureaucratic system. This system is a computer terminal, and the search for your rights begins with a command line interface that is inherently inaccessible. I think anyone who's, had to learn a command line interface kind of knows what I mean. And this is going to be part of a simple physical installation, as well as hopefully an embedded element on the Shall Make Shall Be website. But you enter this terminal trying to figure out what commands are valid, and you will inevitably hit a wall. All of your commands are attempts to articulate your agency within this opaque system that operates on rules and exceptions that nobody fully understands, including me. So I don't think I'll ever understand the particular syntax and sometimes arbitrary behavior of Inform 7, the engine that's driving this project. As you navigate the system, you find other occupants, some less fortunate than you and less able to move around and explore. And as a user, you are conditioned to expect access to the system, so it shouldn't take long to find your rights in the system. And once you find your rights, you can pick them up and then you have them. The system tells you that you have them. That's how you know that they're there. They're written there for you on the screen. And eventually you find yourself in a position to confront the authority that maintains that system. And this is kind of like a stage 1 boss battle. So There are different ways to get around this authority, and this is where you might rely on your intuition and make an exception for yourself. And by this, I mean making up new commands that might happen to work. So in this clip, I'm playing through one way of dealing with this authority. So an exception allows you to exit the system, and that's where the rest of your world opens up. So you leave this administrative limbo and you enter nature, and this is the space that lies beyond the enumeration of the Constitution. It's a more abstract and unreliable space. It's the space of your natural rights. And there are a bunch of different things happening in this clip, so I'm letting it loop a couple of times. But one side idea I'm playing with is from a legal paper by Cheryl I. Harris called Whiteness as Property. And it argues that whiteness resembles an expectation to have the material privileges that come from being granted whiteness. Whiteness is not abstract, but is a property that one can own. So I'm playing through that in this game world where any noun like whiteness or trust or a crowbar is an object that you can pick up and add to your inventory, like property. And I'm lightly wondering to what extent a property like white expectation is synonymous with the expectation of rights afforded by the Ninth Amendment. Nature is also a play on becoming naturalized as an American, which grants you natural American rights. And so your rights are so natural that they can literally escape you so that you doubt that you actually know and retain them. So that's why at this point they've jumped out of your inventory and are now redacted by these black bars. And at that point, your rights will start to act on their own as if they were apart from you. You would then have to chase them down through this world of natural rights. And this gradient represents the legal and moral gray area where you work out the definition of your rights. And in part, it's also a reference to the legal concept of a penumbra, which is where your implicit rights are, in between the lines of the law. So one thing I'm arguing is that the vagueness of the Ninth leaves it open to extreme interpretations, such that I can believe that I have the right to hurt someone if I feel that I have a reason. I have the right to storm the people's house and break everything inside because I have the right to believe that the election was rigged and that the voters, we the people, are wrong and that I am doing the right thing. I have the right to be right at all times on my terms. So all the above is bringing you to a very low fidelity approximation of the Capitol riot on January 6th, which realized one logical extreme of the exceptionalism I think is enabled by the Ninth. And that exceptionalism becomes embodied by white supremacy. So I mean, all of this is a work in progress and this part is not as clear or pointed as it needs to be yet. But I'm not trying to recreate or simulate the Capitol riot per se. It's more about making the move from poetic abstractions, like I've kind of described, to physical imagery, which is about trying to process how gesturing at understanding a legal concept like a fundamental retained right ends up in violence, which David Graeber considers a way to bypass understanding and embrace stupidity instead. So the last section will be inside your house, the people's house, which I won't preview because I haven't written it yet. You might have gathered from the clips that the player is named Role, which is partly a reference to role-based access control, which is a method of user authorization, but partly also raising a question about the role that one plays as part of a society that functions. And again, the work is called Father Figure. And there is an actual father in this game who you can encounter eventually, and he's named Role Model. The father figure is the founding father who, in the American imagination, knew everything before we did, who always knows more than we do, and whose most idealized version predicted that we would change in ways unknown to him. And he accounted for this by writing laws that were open-ended. So in our freest interpretation, Father already knew what was good for us. And one last component I wanted to talk about is that at the end of each turn, when you're in the natural area, Father is summarizing what just happened on that turn, but it reads as though he's telling you to do the action that you just did. And this was actually a happy accident in the studio, which came out of writing things a little bit out of order. But Father's lines retroactively validate that what you did on that turn was the right thing, as though it was your true intention all along, or even your destiny. Even if you were making a blind guess in that moment, Father, the system, will support it. So even though I'm writing different spaces and behaviors into this game world that address various of the themes that I'm interested in, I think this one component expresses the guarantee of the ninth, which allows you to dig around blindly for a right and eventually to find it and to have it one way or another. To me, that assumption or aspiration, depending on who you are, is at the heart of American identity and its struggle and contradiction as well. And that struggle and contradiction is to say, we can do better, we can have better because we know it belongs to us. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much. You're an extraordinary mind, and your command of language is so fascinating. And this is just given us so much to think about. This connection between the founding fathers and this kind of almost Freudian constitutional daddy is really intriguing as well. Thank you so much. It's really a rich space you've outlined. We are going to take just another 4-minute break. We're going to pick it up at 6:30 with arts.codes. And we'll be back in just a minute. Thank you so much. Welcome back, everyone. Our 10th and final Shall Make, Shall Be presentation is by arts.codes, an artist collective and open source distribution platform co-directed by Margaret Schedel and Melissa F. Clarke that celebrates art with computational underpinnings. Melissa F. Clarke is a Brooklyn-based interdisciplinary artist whose work often employs generative and interactive custom-programmed environments. In her work, she extrapolates research into multimedia installations, generative environments, audiovisual sculptures, performances, and printed images. A graduate of NYU ITP, Clarke has taught media arts at SUNY Stony Brook and has participated in residencies at Pioneer Works, the Simon Center for Geometry and Physics, and Visible Future Labs at the School of Visual Arts. Margaret Schedel transcends the boundaries of disparate fields to produce integrated work at the nexus of computation and the arts. With an interdisciplinary career blending classical training in cello and composition, digital audio research, and computational arts education, she is internationally recognized for the creation and performance of ferociously interactive media. Her research in the sonification of gesture and data takes form in interactive opera, virtual reality, and video games. Schedel is professor and co-director of computer music at SUNY Stony Brook. Folks, I'm pleased to welcome arts.codes.
Hello. Sorry about that. Okay. Hi, my name is Melissa. My pronouns are she and her. Welcome to our project Verses, a playable audiovisual installation inspired by the 10th Amendment. So the 10th Amendment has been called both mysterious and remarkably clear. In one sense, it is but a truism, yet over the last several decades, cases decided by the judicial interpretations of the 10th Amendment are becoming more numerous and partisan. Over the years, the Supreme Court has found judicially enforceable limits on the power of the federal government to regulate the states. By 2011, the court decided that individuals can change federal laws on the basis of the 10th Amendment. Currently, we are witnessing states pass laws that seem to override Supreme Court precedents and decision, i.e. abortion and LGBTQ rights. So here is an early, or will be again, an early conceptual sketch of Verses in its entirety. Inspired by the separation of powers in the 10th Amendment, Verses is a playable, interactive sound and visual artwork with two distinctive interfaces. One representing the federal government and one representing the states or the people. So hi everyone, I'm Meg, she or they. As Melissa said, we were really inspired by the separation of powers in the amendment to create a system where votes on the judiciary side would control what kind of interactions could take place on the state side. So essentially the votes on the column determine the rules of the game.
This is the Judiciary Column, which has been completed, that has 9 interactive sides where the judges begin the fate of the gameplay by voting.
And all of the electronics are housed in this Judiciary Column, including the tablets, sensors, a computer, an audio interface, 6 speakers, and the reactive lighting.
On the column, we have 9 kiosk tablets connected to a custom content management system running the game. So this is a high definition iteration of the tablet interface. The tablets display amendment information, then a specific case out of a few pre-selected cases that users have the ability to vote on. So when we were developing the concept for Verses, we were particularly struck by the final clause of the 10th Amendment, which reads, "are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." This unambiguously reserved all non-delegated power to its original source, the people. We then designed the state side as flowing flag-like ribbons that would interact with the judicially decided algorithms of the sound and the visuals.
Because of the installation constraints at Federal Hall, we're going to be using proximity sensors within the column instead of ribbons.
So here's a little screen capture of our judicial game interface on the 9 columns. All 9 tablets are timed and synced with each other so that the users for each game must decide and submit their votes concurrently before the second part of the game begins.
So they're introduced to the 10th Amendment, then the facts of a case. We have several cases in the queue. And then they're prompted with a question. All the while they know that this is a time decision. They scroll down and they decide yes or no with the prompt, and they see the timer is running and this person says no. And then they're told the sound and visuals of the game that commence have been decided by their votes. Looking under the hood of our piece, we have the content management system. Is basically a cloud-based system where it's storing the cases that we have preloaded, and it takes the voting data of the judges. And once it's compiled, it applies it to the algorithms of the sound and the visual output for the game interaction.
So essentially the cases decide which set of sounds will or will not be affected by the censors. So if the participants delegate a power to the federal government, that track becomes stable. So here, a synthesizer either repeats every 8th note if it is a federal control, or can get up to 196 notes if under state control. Some of the interactions are more subtle. So for the drums, it's the amount of reverb that is controlled. So the idea is you need a balance of federal and state control in order to make a piece that is not too boring or too active. For our vocals, we enlisted the help of Tony Blackman, who freestyled about the Bill of Rights and the 10th Amendment. So if the voters give the power to the federal government on the case that decides the vocal interaction, there are no vocals. But if they give the power to the states, the amount of the vocals, from just interjections to only verses to only choruses to the whole soundscape, are at once controlled.
Guarantee civil rights and liberties and freedom of speech so that we can speak free. So the press can print what it deems necessary. Freedom of religion because preference varies. Sets rules so there's fairness in the law. Here's the key, reserves powers and all. Delegated. Wait, hold up. Just a minute.
Nice. So again, we're arts.codes. We're an artist collective and open source distribution platform that celebrates the computational underpinnings of art.
And some of our earlier projects included Hatcheck, which was a piece that we designed for ShmooCon, where we used actual ISP data from a contest to get a ticket to the con to create an interactive experience. So essentially users can switch which pearl to ride in an attempt to get to the center of the landscape and get a ticket to the conference. It was both a VR experience and then a mesh sculpture with the abstracted projections of the video and audio happening live in VR behind it. And here's what's happening inside the VR. So the height of the landscape, the paths of the pearl, and all of the sounds are controlled by that ISP data, which had a time element. So everything is basically created from this data.
So after Hatcheck, we created Glass Menagerie, which presented a portable installation and virtual reality experience in collaboration with Brookhaven National Laboratory Center for Functional Nanomaterials. An early conceptual sketch here demonstrates the VR portion, which we wanted to present the nano data to be reversed in scale to the perception of the participant. So basically bigger than life. As part of the installation experience, we 3D printed the data so that the folks within the experience would have a tangible experience with the data. So that was basically showcased alongside of the VR. And here's a demo of the VR experience using the data for the 3D objects, which are the visuals and the sound. Menagerie is also a platform for creating frameworks so that scientists can create their own three-dimensional forms and virtual reality iterations using their data sets. So here we are sharing it, the product with the scientists and exploring that with them during their 10th anniversary.
So thank you to our fellow presenters, our organizers, and our audience. We're really looking forward to playing all the games in Federal Hall in July.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg and Melissa. That was the work that you do is impressively sophisticated. I'm always blown away by your work. Thank you so much for sharing your work this evening. And thanks to all the other artists who presented this evening as well. Next up, in just a few minutes at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time, all the artists who spoke this evening will participate in a Q&A panel moderated by the Curation and Exhibition Director of the Shall Make Shall Be project, Professor of Games and Learning at Parsons School for Design, John Sharp. So we'll see you all in just a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone. So for the last few minutes here, we're going to have a group discussion, Q&A, moderated by Professor of Games and Learning at the Parsons School of Design, John Sharp. Come on in, John. And come on in, everyone else, too. I'm going to pop out.
Well, thank you. Go on. Thank you, everybody else from the studio, for having us today. Thank you all, artists, for your awesome talks. I know y'all's work fairly well from the last 18 months or however long we've been on this trip together. But every time I speak to you and I hear you all speak about your work, I'm learning more and more. So thank you again. So first question, which whoever is moved to speak, we'll conduct this kind of like a Quaker meeting. Those of you who want to answer one of my questions, please do. If you do not want to answer it, then please don't. I'm really curious about how getting in the weeds with your amendments has informed your thinking about the amendment you've been working on. As you've moved through the project, did your initial impressions and sort of the impetus for your work change at all, or did you become more strong in your resolve and your interpretation and feelings about the amendment you worked on?
Maybe Melissa and I can take that.
Yeah, awesome.
I don't think our plan changed much. We were really inspired by that states, people, or federal from the very beginning. And I think what really has changed is how we listen to the news, right? Melissa listed a bunch of cases now that are going to be decided by the 10th Amendment. And it's just fascinating that it wasn't used for a long time and now is. Melissa, anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think that's pretty much it. Just the context is evolving right in front of us with current laws that are being passed, especially with abortion and LGBTQ rights. So, you know, the original conceptual designs haven't changed much, but definitely reinforcing that understanding just with many of the amendments with contemporary events. I would say that, like Meg pointed out, we had a very elaborate plan in terms of the installation, but then went on a site visit. And that part, just the physical piece, we were like, oh, we got to scale this back. So, but knowing that this exhibit will show in other venues and it's possible to do other iterations of the piece, and seeing that there is another piece online and we're kind of interested in doing something similar. Yeah, just also being responsive to the site is another part of the iteration process in the 10th Amendment piece.
Cool. Anyone else have any thoughts on that question?
Sure. I would say that my concept developed and changed a lot as I spoke to more lawyers, and I feel like my piece is really like I feel like I was the test subject for my piece, and like finding that entryway in, I feel like I've become much more engaged and able to articulate why I think our punitive justice system is broken, but also try to like really find like a very specific small way to talk about that. And that was definitely the hardest and most interesting thing to me.
I'm curious if there's been any kind of, I don't know how to phrase it, ambient bleed from being part of this project and thinking about some of the other amendments in the Bill of Rights. If any of you are now inspired to maybe think about or maybe wish you were working on one of the other amendments in the Bill of Rights.
I can respond to that just a little bit. just at a high level, I think all of the pieces that I've seen, I just want to congratulate the artists because their interpretation of the amendment has made me want to dive deeper into each one. Like, I really feel that each artist, through their discovery process, has brought to the surface a lot of very tangible concepts behind these amendments or legal speak. And I'm really thankful to have learned so much. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, I always thought that 9 was the weirdest one. And I have no idea. Like, I kind of want to look up the history of it now and see what cases have revolved around it and what are these hidden rights. But Ryan, that project seems so insane. I can't wait to sit down at the terminal and give that a shot.
Yeah, thanks. It's funny, like for me, like I was kind of like, honestly, like I was looking at the amendments and I was like, should I apply for this thing or not? And then I read this one and it just immediately, like, I mean, it was like all of the kind of tensions and frustrations that had built up at the beginning of the pandemic, like just kind of like just came and like slapped me in the face, so to speak. Like, and that is sort of like the grasp that amendment has had on like my kind of my personal interpretations of what's been going on around me, like actually hasn't changed. And so there was a point at which I thought, oh, I wondered if I was just really strongly projecting a very personal reading onto it. And so actually when I met with Leah Rosen, the legal advisor on this, I basically asked her, like, it seems like this amendment would both like support a notion of like privacy rights as well as like forms of extremism or violence. And she said, yeah, basically that it is vague enough, for them. That's perhaps one reason why I don't think that the 9th has actually been a deciding, I don't know if the terminology is like citation in any like major cases. It was part of a few very important ones, but it wasn't ever like the main amendment cited. So anyway.
Fun fact, when we first put the call out, we assumed we were going to be inundated with First and Second Amendment proposals. And actually the 9th and the 3rd were the two that yielded the most proposals. And the only reason I can guess that with the 9th was Radiolab's podcast More Perfect did an episode about the 9th Amendment, which made it sound really kind of cool and mysterious. That's my only theory as to why the 9th received so much attention. Yeah, the pandemic, it came up a number of times in your presentations, and I feel like has really, in many ways, has really kind of forced things to the surface. And I feel like in a weird way, maybe it's just because I'm inside this project, but I feel like I see the amendments popping up in the news constantly, whether not by name, but by IS. I see legally where this is going. I'm curious if any of you have had similar kind of impressions of seeing the Bill of Rights more fully in our world.
Well, I can speak to that in terms of the 7th Amendment, a right to a jury trial in civil cases, because the news for the last 2 years has been so contentious. And without naming names, I know there are a lot of people in politics that were waiting for the other shoe to drop and consequences to come from crimes. And it seems like ultimately one of the mechanisms that I'd never realized was so robust is civil liability. And that many people who've should face consequences, those consequences may ultimately be in civil courts before a jury, and the 7th Amendment will be alive and determining the results of those cases.
One of the other interesting things, sorry.
You go.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other interesting things I kind of noticed around this was like how many, because of the nature of how our digitally mediated lives changed. Juries were being done on Zoom. Immigration laws, for example, are completely okay with people staying outside. The residency requirements of the country for being in the country has been changed. So I can basically do this talk sitting in India where I'm still allowed back in America. So like those kind of the nature of technology has also kind of made some of these laws much more interesting than they probably were before, because of the sheer nature of our presence, of physical presence that has changed so dramatically. Like even with the third law, like what does it mean for a soldier to come inside your house where our lives are based? Yeah, like there's so many of these issues that have been brought to the surface because of technology.
I mean, I think hand in hand with the pandemic was the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and all of the other lives that were lost, as well as that increased pressure on immigration. And so like all of these things have really combined to really draw our attentions to the Bill of Rights and what these rights actually are and are not for us. One last question. Playable works, all works are prone to interpretations that may or may not have anything to do with what the creator had intended, but I feel like playable works are particularly prone to that, and particularly what I'll call the gamer mindset that a lot of players will bring to their experiences. So I'm really curious if there's any impressions you all have that you do not want your players to leave their play experiences with.
I guess for our game, something I'm excited about, especially when we're talking about gamers, I think designing an experience that is inherently unfair, which is significant to our concept, is really, really important in a landscape of not just everything going on right now, but also like how much control gamers want to kind of like project onto content, if that makes sense. I don't know if anyone has had similar experience with that. So being able to design an experience where we can defiantly say like, no, like you don't have this say, and then extend that further to challenge their empathy and be like, hey, no, this is also like a lot of people's lives every day. It's very cool.
We can just refer them over to Ryan's game if they go into that zone.
Exactly. I mean, it's always been a struggle of the kind of capital G game industry in the United States in particular, is even though games are systems that Chris Crawford, who's kind of a OG of white male game design, computer game design, always talked about games as systems of fantasy, which is, I think exactly what you're speaking to, right? That they're this place where their power fantasies can play out. And I think it's one of the things that attracted us in the review process to all of your projects was that they pushed against some of those instincts of kind of gamers and kind of a game mindset. I think it's, anyway, I thank you all for your thoughts on this, and I believe we should turn the stage back over to Golan. Thank you again, artists, and I look forward to seeing you all in person in July in a big marble rotunda.
Thank you all. I'm so grateful for the energy that you brought to this. I'm now going to close the evening up just with some thank yous to how this project all came together. Thank you to you artists, and thank you, John. if you can close your cameras now, other artists. I'm just gonna kind of spiel for a bit. Thank you so much. So thank you, John, and thank you all the artists who spoke this evening and also yesterday as well. The Shall Make, Shall Be project, the Bill of Rights at Play, was organized with support from a private gift to the Directors Fund at the Frank-Ratchye Studio for Creative Inquiry at Carnegie Mellon University, and with support from New York University and the New School's Parsons School of Design. The exhibition opens this July at Federal Hall National Memorial in cooperation with the National Parks of New York Harbor Conservancy. We are so excited to see this exhibition fully realized in person this coming summer, and the monograph, which will be published soon after, documenting these play experiences and which accompanies them with essays by legal scholars. I'd like to thank our New York-based partners, Luc DuBois of the NYU Tandon School of Engineering, who conceived of this project and as a curator-in-residence at the studio, as well as editorial director Lane Nooney at NYU and curation and exhibition director John Sharp at the Parsons School of Design, and also Renee Barnes of the Federal Hall National Memorial. I'd also like to thank the additional members of the Shall Make, Shall Be Selection Committee, Deborah Archer of NYU Law, Salome Asega of the Ford Foundation, Shauna Bryant, Astria Suparak, Jessica Hammer and Paolo Pedercini of Carnegie Mellon, Elizabeth Joe of UC Davis Law. And I'd like to thank my terrific colleagues at the Studio for Creative Inquiry who have helped realize this project, including Bill Rogers, Linda Hager, Tom Hughes, Harrison Apple, Nico Ross, and Carol Hernandez. The Shall Make, Shall Be lecture series conference and project was a project of Carnegie Mellon University. Located in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, our school is situated on land that has been continuously inhabited for over 16,000 years, serving as a home to members of the Adena, Hopewell, Monongahela, Lenape, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Tasagra-Coami, Delaware, and Mohican communities, whose relationships with the land continue to this day. We acknowledge that we operate as Carnegie Mellon University on the traditional land of these peoples, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. This calls us to commit to continuing to learn how to be better stewards of the land we inhabit as well. Thank you, everyone, and good night.